life after death. I want you to listen to this song for a brief moment and tell me what you hear.
I've traveled the many the sunlight beneath my sky, but I am still here. I've fallen from many heights, took the time to heal my wounds, and I still rising and growing stronger. Even when I'm broken, faces back to me, still the all back to fear and carry on. I'm growing stronger. Went through hell to heaven, and I know I'll be soon. But I won't fear. Always learn from the journey, become wiser than before. And I find peace and growing stronger. Even when I'm broken, things back together, still not all back to fear and carry on. I'm growing stronger.
As you listen to that song, it talks about a journey, about where there's failure and how people fell forward. Death is not the end. It is the beginning and the end. Where one part of your life you let go of and you move on to the next. I've seen, I've experienced this even to the very depths of what it is meant to be seen as. I had near-death experiences when I was just a child, and even when I was just born into this world. I was born as a stillborn. But people don't realize that in that moment, Even then, we are at choice. At first, I wanted to run away. I did not want to be in this life. Because I had been born during a time where there was total chaos. At the time, I was born into a life where people used everything that they had to put somebody through what was torture or a perceived torture. At the time when I first had a connection all the way back to my birth, when I went into a deep meditation and allowed myself to be connected to that part of myself at that time, I got to re-see something that I forgot. Now, most people don't think that it's possible to reconnect all the way back to birth unless you have been there yourself. Later in life, as I reconnected back to this stage of my life, I learned something. I learned that one, my mother, who passed away giving me birth, I saw her spirit leave. And over time, I gained different perceptions of that experience. When I was going through the many different kind of challenges that I did, the near-death experiences were a gift. I didn't used to look at it that way. In fact, it felt very hard, very heavy, and as if I just wanted to leave this life and go to what I had seen and just stay there. But when my mother passed away giving me birth and my spirit was connected to her spirit in a single moment, because I was going through a near-death experience myself, she and I had a conversation about this life. And she gave me an opportunity to see that I had access to information. And at the time, she used the words ancestors, saying that our ancestors had information that I would need, and that she was going to be a part of offering this gift to me. She gave me a gift of being able to access my ancestors at that time, and I received it, but didn't know how it was going to help me get through. And I really went through a lot of anger, a lot of grief before I even came back, because I just didn't want her to go. I felt abandoned. I felt like I had lost all hope, and that I was heading into the dragon's lair. When I was born into the sex slave trade. I was also born into a life where a lot of things weren't my choice. At least that's what I thought at the time. But I chose this life. I chose it because I simply wanted the highest of honors. That no matter what I went through, I would find a way through. I would show people that anything is possible. And not just possible, but inevitable. People don't understand what that means until they have been there. But I went through several near-death experiences, and I kept on gaining more and more information and more knowledge every single time that it happened. But due to also having traumatic brain injuries, it was very hard to allow the physical body and mind to be willing to accept the information, but not just accept it, embrace it, and allow it to flow through you as a conduit so that you could actually share information and knowledge with people that would have helped them. And the people that were doing what they did to me were trying to access it, but didn't know how. They were trying to find answers of a way back to a life where there was light in their lives, but they were trying to go about it in their own way, thinking that if they did it in reverse, that they would find answers. They probably did find some answers, but then continued to do torture and death and all these other things, and that was within the death cults. When my adoptive mother carried me out of a place where there was a ritualistic site, where I was about ready to be the sacrifice and dipped into acid and never return, somehow she found out about where I was, and I still don't know to this day how she found out. But she did. And even though she was a part of the sex slave trade and was doing all these other horrific things to me, she saw something still in me and was willing to fight for it. Enough that she had risked her own life and went in and carried me out. And this was after she had already lost the custody battle. My dad never knew of this story, because what they did was that they blocked it out. They used healing tools to cover up what they didn't want others to know or see. There was people there that were telling her, you need to take her back to where you picked her up from. And instead of taking me back to where the acid was, she took me back to a location where the other people had already picked me up from. And allowed me to continue walking home. There was a police officer right around the corner, and I could feel her presence when I first got there. Now, keep in mind, because they blocked out the memory, I was still terrified of her. I was still terrified of her at this time because I didn't know how to see what she had done, because they'd put a blockage in place. But these were such horrific events that when it happened, I had seen what had happened to the others. I had seen them be dipped into acid and to never return. My heart even still aches to this day for those lives that were lost. But again, they chose this life, along as much as I did, along with the information that I did. Sorry. One second. Sorry. I'm dealing with phlegm coming up. It's something that I've learned that it's due to connected to a lot of emotions still surfacing when talking about these events. It's a way of processing. But That day, my life was never the same. They allowed me to continue to be in fear of her. They put the blockages in place and didn't want me to see the good. I knew the good existed. I just didn't know where. But when that memory came forward, I got to see the good that she had. She was willing to risk her life. She was willing to risk everything else for me. Why? I may never know the answer to her why. But I know that I'm still here. I know that she even drowned me and brought me back because I was being disobedient and not doing what they asked me to do within the sex slave trade. They were just trying to show me their way of life and what they found they enjoyed. But I wasn't in a space to learn from them, especially when they kept on doing things like that, especially when they caused me to have those near-death experiences as a punishment. This life is not easy. But I will tell you this. I've learned many life lessons from these experiences, but it took me finding those that were willing to teach me in a loving and kind way, where they weren't hurting me over and over again, where they weren't spanking me or trying to cause me to have near-death experiences as a punishment or abusing me on some other way. Then I was a lot more willing to listen. But even then, because of all the experiences that I had, even once I met those individuals that were coming from a more unconditional standpoint, they still had their own issues. But they did everything they could to help. When they did so, life and death became a different experience. I began to understand life and death in a whole different way. Until one day I was drawing a picture and had seen a line in the center like you would on a ruler. And on the ruler, right smack dab in the center where there is 0. I learned what was actually there was the continuum. And after that centerpiece on the outsides, the -1 and the +1. The -1 was where the near-death experiences existed, somewhere within. And on the +1 was where the life was. Now, I had been taught that death was a punishment. So I would continue to punish myself over time. But when you heard that song in the beginning, yes, there was struggle. Yes, there was failing forward. But the person was, if you were to watch that video on your own, it's called Stronger. And it's by a group called Fearless Soul. But the idea is to show somebody that there is always a way to move forward. Sometimes it meant by punishing myself at different times because that was my belief. So I'd continue to punish myself. I'd find a way to make sure I was punished. Sorry about that. And Other times, I would make sure to find a way that I got to feel what was good. But it was because when I had those near-death experiences, I saw so much that was good. And even as a young child, I asked myself, why does my adoptive mother do this? Why? Why did my father do what he did? Why did any of them? One of the answers was because it was done to them. And they didn't know what they were doing. Because the same way that it had been forced upon me, so that I wouldn't remember, I would continue going about life, but I would still have things that they either implanted, different ways of teachings, or they would leave me in a state of where I couldn't even fathom what a life was like outside of torture, outside of being forced to die, so that I could live their way of life. And later I had different parents and they would teach me different things, but some of them carried similar teachings. Even though I had escaped from the sex slave trade and other things when I was a young child, it made me wonder who else had been affected by these things. The ripple effect from a single person and their choices and decisions. Life and death. Now, do they serve a purpose? A true purpose? Yes. Over time, I began to allow myself to explore this more. Some of you may have watched the children's show Avatar, The Last Airbender. And he is able to connect to the spiritual realm, as you would see in different ways. But one of the things he had to learn was to reach the avatar state, or a consciousness that was an awareness of life in a way that most people just didn't have. Now, I had that as a young child, but I also had all of this stuff buried within me. Even to this day, I have stuff buried within me in a way that's like, oh, I'm carrying around all this weight. But I've learned to love the weight. But I've also learned to release and let go of what I no longer loved. What wasn't serving me. What was holding me back. Letting go of what no longer serves you is still connected to the same teachings of life and death within the continuum. It just looks differently. It's just a different perception. Not everybody knows the same answers, but some people know a lot of the answers. So if you were to actually perceive death and life for what it really is in different times, in different spaces, instead of feeling like you're angry all the time, you still have a grieving process, but you can also shorten that grieving process. You can choose to say, you know what, by this date, I am going to be done with grieving. So that you can be done with holding on to such an energy and such a pain and sadness that you don't have to suffer. You don't have to be addicted to pain and suffering. You can allow that addiction to be resolved. You set the intention that I'm going to resolve this energy, resolve the grief, so I can move forward. Some people don't realize that they can actually decide that, or that they have been deciding it, but just didn't have the words or the level of awareness that was necessary to have that consciousness and to have a knowingness that you can choose when to be done with grieving. Now, sometimes we also have ego that we use in a way that's more of, I have to defend this belief, I have to defend the grief, and I have to stay in the grief. And I don't get to be allowed to grieve because someone else taught me it's not okay to grieve. Allow yourself to grieve. And allow yourself to pass through the eye of the continuum of where life and death exists. So that you too can allow yourself to have freedom from punishment, from pain and suffering. Because you are worth it, you know. Allow yourself to grow stronger. Allow yourself to create a life that is of goodness. Suffering is only as good as long as it feels good. But as soon as it doesn't feel good, it no longer serves you to be suffering. Some people choose to believe that suffering feels good. I don't know how they do it, but they do. But they also know that it served a purpose. I haven't reached that level of understanding and awareness even for that one. Of understanding how suffering can be good. But knowing what I do know, the little bit of information that I can tap into that consciousness, that knowingness, lets me know that there is other answers there waiting. And that once I've learned the lessons that I needed to from this, there will be so many different things that I'll be able to resolve that much faster. So that I simply don't have to suffer anymore. There's moments I still suffer, but yet there's other times that I'm in total bliss and ecstasy. Life and death does not have to be hard. But yet, for some reason, a lot of the time it is. Because we're choosing for it to be hard. But once we choose that there is, or not even choose, it's more of acknowledging, recognizing that it can be easy to deal with. Then we continue to look for the way that is easy to deal with it instead of the hard way. Because some of us feel like that life has to be hard. You have to work hard for life. You have to do those kind of things. But there is a different way. We no longer have to suffer. But a lot of us have been taught that it's a necessity, or that it's what's right, or that it's the only way. But it's not. There are other ways. You just have to be allowing yourself to find them and be present with them. Even if you were to stop and close your eyes when you're dealing with that grief, and you allow yourself to recognize that there's another way for a moment, and you look within, and you go, what is it that is the other way to relieve myself of this grief? What do I need to do to allow myself to overcome this grief? And be with whatever answer comes to mind. The be with in a single moment between life and death in the continuum of either one. It depends on what you decide. It depends on what you really want. If you want to feel this other thing and sit there and argue and sit there and say, I don't want this, some part of you obviously does. And you need to acknowledge it. Otherwise, it's not going to shift. You're not going to move through it. It's going to be much harder to find out how to shift through that grief, how to shift through life and death. Be with the answer. Be present with the grief even, and allow yourself to grieve. No matter what anybody else says. I've known people that will sit there and teach you it's not okay to grieve because they've been taught the same thing. But which one feels better? Does it feel okay to grieve? Or does it feel okay to stuff it down? Does it feel good to grieve? Or does it feel good to stuff it down? You decide. At this point in time, I will leave the decision up to you. Know that you are loved. Big bear hugs. Namaste.